All right, let's talk about ecology and some basics about climate in this particular video. So ecology is the study of how organisms interact with their environment, details about that interaction and about those different environments. And so we're going to talk in this chapter mostly about the different types of environments that we find on Earth and also some things about climate and the atmosphere and climate change. We can organize ecology into some categories here, and these are really a hierarchy going from small to large. So organismal ecology is how individual organisms interact with their environment. Population ecology, which we'll talk about in the next chapter. A population is a group of individuals of a single species. So how a group of individuals of one species are interacting. A community is a group of species that are in close contact and regularly encounter each other in their environment. So that would be community ecology. Ecosystem ecology would include all the communities in a particular ecosystem. So you might have the marine community and then also the beach community and the island community and of different species. So everything in one ecosystem, all the different communities, those are the whole ecosystem then. Landscape ecology would include multiple ecosystems. So if you have a mountain, for example, at the high elevations, you're going to have a completely different type of ecosystem than at the sea level elevations in that region. So that would be landscape. And then global ecology, that's considering the entire planet. And we'll talk a little bit about climate change with that. So climate isn't weather. So weather is the day-to-day changes, what exactly is happening. What temperature is it? Is it raining? Whatever. That's weather. Climate is the long-term picture of that. So our climate here in the Midwest has seasonality, and we have a winter temperature range and a different summer temperature range. That's our climate. And so we can say if the weather on any particular day is average, is the temperature above average or below average by comparing it to the climate for the region. What are the averages for that region? And so the climate includes the temperature, precipitation, which precipitation means water is coming from the sky in some form, either rain, snow, whatever. The amount of sunlight that a particular area receives, and that's mostly based on latitude. So the equator gets the most intense sunlight, and the further away you go from the equator, the less intense the sunlight is. And then also wind, which can be very drying to organisms especially. So the global climate patterns depend on solar energy, but also where relative to the equator we're talking about, which is going to make a difference in how the sun is going to affect a particular area. The farther north or south of the equator we go in latitude, we're going to see some general patterns in climate variation, with it generally being warmer close to the equator and colder further away from the equator. And that's because of how the sun strikes the earth. So at the equator, we have the most intense sunlight because that's where the most direct, intense rays of the sun are. But further north or further south, it works the same way. Because the sun is hitting at an angle, that means the same amount of sun is spread out over a larger area. So that means any particular spot is actually getting less sunlight. Global air circulation patterns have been studied with great interest for several hundred years now, and we know a lot about them. Although there are there's general patterns, and then there's a few exceptions to those general patterns that we will talk about. So warm air rises, cold air falls. When really humid, moist air gets colder, it rains. Near the equator, there's a particular pattern that occurs because, of course, this is where the circulating air cells are the most intense because we have the highest amount of sunlight striking the equator. And what happens is we have the most intense warming near the equator. So warm air is rising, it's being warmed by the sun, it's picking up moisture and evaporating moisture from either the surface of the sea or from plants and surface area, soil, and it evaporates, and this warm, humid air, as it rises, it cools, and that triggers rain because cool air cannot hold as much moisture, so the water condenses into droplets, and that will form clouds and eventually rain. So this air, once it has uh, uh, become higher altitude, it loses its moisture, or some of its moisture, because it rains, and then that air goes both north and south. And then as it gets, because it's cold, then it will start to fall. And it tends to fall around 30 degrees north and 30 degrees south latitude. So we have cooler air, and then when it reaches the surface, it tends to go both north and south. And that's why we tend to find deserts at around 30 degrees north and 30 degrees south. And this also determines the direction of prevailing winds in those areas. So between these two lines of 30 degrees north and 30 degrees south, we tend to get surface winds going towards the equator, and they also tend to swing westerly. And this was very important to early sailors. You had to know which seasons those winds were blowing and which direction they were blowing, or you wouldn't go where you wanted to go. The cells that circulate further north, so we call those circulating cells closest to the equator Hadley cells. The other cells are less intense as you go further north, and we're not going to worry about what the names of those are. Even though they tell you here, Ferrel cells and polar cells, I'm not going to ask you for those. The Hadley cells have the strongest circulation, and that's due to the sun. So here we have, we can see what, well, at least the Western Hemisphere here, where 30 degrees north and 30 degrees south fall. And in fact, there is a desert here in the American Southwest and northern Mexico. And there's also a dry, arid region here in the southern part of South America. But you'll notice that this 30 degrees north latitude line goes right through the southeastern United States, Alabama, Georgia, Mississippi, where there is not a desert. So why isn't there a desert right here? Well, this is one of those exceptions, and it's due to a local condition, the Gulf of Mexico. So moisture and storm systems tend to flow north here from the Gulf of Mexico. The Gulf of Mexico is a very warm pocket here. It's not as cold as the Atlantic Ocean. It's shallower and warmer. And so warm, moist air rises from the Gulf of Mexico and brings rain to this region right here, which would otherwise have a tendency to be dry. The further away you go from the equator, the more variation in seasons you have as well. So, you know, we experience pretty big swings in seasonal temperatures here in northern Illinois. The closer you get to the equator, the less change there is from season to season, until there's almost no noticeable change at all between seasons as you get closer to the equator. And this is due to the tilt of Earth's axis. So the Earth isn't vertical relative to the sun. In fact, it's tilted on an angle of 23 degrees, and that wobbles a little bit. It's not exactly the same all the time through Earth's history. But because of this tilt, that means that for part of the time, the northern hemisphere will be tilted towards the sun, and day and night is happening as this is rotating here in place. So the northern hemisphere is tilted towards the sun in summer, and the southern hemisphere is experiencing winter when we are experiencing summer. So we are in winter right now in the northern hemisphere. That means in Australia, it's summer right now. It's there, like our July is right now in Australia. So southern hemisphere is the opposite seasons that we do in the northern hemisphere. So in the winter, the northern hemisphere is tilted away, and this has some peculiarity. So you'll notice here these dotted lines that are at 23 degrees north and 23 degrees south. These are called the Tropic of Cancer, that's the northern one, and the Tropic of Capricorn, that's the southern one. This is the northernmost extent and the southernmost extent where you actually get the sun directly overhead on the summer solstice around June 21st. So you'll notice that this is the Tropic of Cancer doesn't actually go through the United States, except for, well, it's not even Florida. It's even south of Florida. So that means that nowhere in the United States is the sun ever directly overhead. The sun gets closer to being overhead in the summer, but it's still going to be, even in the summer, slightly tipped towards the southern horizon. And the further north you go, the more extreme that tilt will be. So in the winter, if you're up in Canada, the sun is going to be very low in the sky, and it won't be above the horizon for very many hours at all until finally when you get to the Arctic Circle. The reason why the Arctic Circle and the Antarctic Circle, they didn't draw it on here, but there's an Antarctic Circle as well. Within the Antarctic Circle, in the winter, the sun doesn't come above the horizon. And in the summer, it's above the horizon all the time. So that's, so there's 6 months of daylight and 6 months of darkness above the Arctic Circle. So another peculiarity of the tilt. And that also means that if you live very close to the Arctic Circle, but south of it, in the winter, you might only have 2 hours of sunlight during the day. And in the summer, you might have 21 hours of sunlight. So the sun will be above the horizon until 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning and then set at 4 a.m. So it gets more extreme at the further north or the further south you go. We just don't usually think about the southern hemisphere because way fewer people live in the southern hemisphere. So the bodies of water also have an effect on climate, local climate, the land masses that are near those large bodies of water. And they have to be pretty large. A normal size pond or a lake isn't going to do it. Lake Michigan is one of the largest lakes in the world, and it's large enough to affect the local climate. So you might hear that on the weather forecast. In the summer, they'll say, well, it's going to be 80 degrees, but cooler close to the lake. And there'll be a lake effect on temperatures. And in the winter, the reverse happens. Closer to the lake, it'd be a little bit warmer than it is 20 or 30 miles away from the lake. And that's because water does not change temperature as rapidly as the air. So even when it's been really cold here for weeks and weeks, Lake Michigan is still going to be mostly open water. If we have a really cold winter, the more of the lake that's covered by ice, the less of a lake effect, warming effect there is, because that warm water is covered up by a sheet of ice. There's also a lot of circulation in the ocean that's going to affect what that effect is going to be, because if the water off of the coast of a particular area is cold, that's going to have a different effect on the local climate than if it's warm. In the northern hemisphere, these currents tend to go clockwise, and in the southern hemisphere, they go counterclockwise. And we'll talk a little bit more about the Gulf Stream, one of those circulating currents that's really important for climate, is one of the ones also that people are worried is going to change with global warming. There's other kinds of circulation in the ocean as well that are due to increasing and decreasing salinity. Very saltier water is heavier and sinks. So there are currents where in the tropics, water is evaporating, the salt doesn't evaporate, so that water becomes saltier and then sinks. And then in the deep ocean, the reverse happens. So there are places where you have upwellings of very deep, nutrient-rich, cold water. So there's more things than just the rotation of the Earth that's affecting ocean circulation. It's very complicated. So land that's near cool water, during the day, warm air is going to rise, and there will be this shift of air back and forth. At night, air from over the ocean will move in, and during the day, that warm air moves back out again over the ocean. But it will affect temperature. In California, if you've been to the California coast, the ocean off the coast of California and Oregon and Washington is relatively cool. And so in the summer, it could be really hot in the 90s if you go 50 miles away from the ocean. But as you get to if you drive towards the ocean, it will get noticeably cooler, and you get to the beach and it might be 55 degrees on the beach. So it really makes a huge difference. So this is a satellite map of ocean surface temperatures. And here we can see the east coast of the United States and Europe and Africa over here. And this is the Gulf Stream. So this is just part of that clockwise circulating gyre that's in the Atlantic Ocean. So warm water moves north and east, and it really makes an enormous difference to the climate of Western Europe. London, which has a climate that's sort of like Seattle, maybe, or Boston, where they get, it doesn't get really hot in the summer. They get, well, except for recently, they might get snow in the winter, but it usually melts pretty quickly. They're actually further north than some large cities in Canada like Calgary and Winnipeg. London is actually further north. So that shows you what a strong effect the Gulf Stream has. And France as well has a very mild climate, but it's actually pretty far north compared to, it's about as far north as we are here, but they don't have the cold winters that we do, and it also moderates their climate in the summer. It doesn't get as hot as it does here. El Nino is another climate effect. So El Nino is a climate effect that comes and goes about every 20 years. It hasn't been studied for that many decades, so we don't know a huge amount about it. It was only noticed that this was occurring in the 1980s. So we do know that we have observed several El Nino events now. So when there's an El Nino, the very cold waters off the western coast of South America are replaced by warmer waters. A very large area of extra warm water forms in the Pacific, and then it flows eastward. And this has a very negative effect on fishing. This warm water means that the cold, nutrient-rich waters, which are normally welling up from the deep ocean here and feeding sea life, that stops. And so this is usually very bad for the fishing industry in Western South America. And for us here in the Midwest, it usually means wetter summers. And then they have the opposite effect of this, which they call La Nina. And I don't think we're in an El Nino this year. But they come and go. It's cyclical, but not super predictable. Mountains also have a big influence on local climate. Mountains push the air up as the air flows around it. And as the air gets pushed up, it cools. And cool air can't hold as much moisture, so it causes cloud formation and rain. So as air flows over a mountain, it loses its moisture through rain, and as that air descends then on the other side of the mountain range, it's drier. And so regions on the eastern side, well, this would be northern hemisphere, regions on the eastern side of mountains tend to be dry. And we can see that very clearly if you've ever been to Colorado, which is mostly east of the Rockies. It's very dry, kind of high desert / prairie for most of Colorado. But just on the west side of those mountains, it's much wetter and rainier. So, and we call that a rain shadow when rain is blocked by some geological feature. That's a rain shadow. And this nice image here, this is air just flowing over this mountain, and there's just a little cloud here where the mountain is, because that's that moist air getting pushed up into the colder upper atmosphere. The water condenses into a cloud, and then when the air flows back down, the cloud disappears. So this is what that looks like. So we have moist air flowing in. It rises and cools. Cool air can't hold as much moisture, so it rains. And then that cool, drier air flows down and warms up again, and so you tend to get drier conditions on the leeward side of the mountain. So this side would be the windward side, because that's the side the wind is mostly hitting. Leeward is the opposite of that. So Death Valley is the driest and hottest place in the United States, and it's mostly due to rain shadow from the Sierra Nevada mountains. In fact, it's got mountains on both sides, and it's also really low elevation. So what happens is the moisture is lost as weather systems are coming over the Sierras. And because Death Valley is so low, that air really descends quite a bit. And that means that it's even drier. And the low elevation also makes it hotter as well. So why it's called Death Valley. Although there is a lot of living things there. It's just not so good for humans. Mountains, especially in far from the equator, are going to have a big effect on the amount of sunlight, depending on if organisms live on the northern or the southern side. So in the northern hemisphere, because the sunlight is always coming in on an angle, the sun is never directly overhead if you're north of the Tropic of Cancer. So that means that if there is a mountain, the southern side is going to get a lot more direct sunlight, while the northern slopes are going to be in complete shadow much of the time, which of course is very bad for plant growth, to not ever get any direct sunlight. We also have the comparison of latitude and elevation. So elevation would be how high you are on a mountain, and latitude would be how far you are from the equator. So we see similar effects with the type of ecosystems we have, depending on if you are high latitude and high elevation. We're going to see similar things. So as we go further north from the equator, the type of trees that we find change from tropical trees that can't tolerate any frost or cold at all to temperate forest type trees which can tolerate a cold season and a warm season, to boreal forest where we have mostly trees that can't tolerate hot temperatures at all. And then finally we hit the tree line where it's too cold for any trees to grow. And we'll see the same thing on a mountain. So the tree line is the point at which all the trees just vanish because it's too cold. Uh, there will still be plants. There's a lot of grasses and mosses and other things that can tolerate those cold, cold temperatures, but usually not trees. So we call that the tree line. And you'll hit a tree line as you drive up a mountain. You'll reach a point. The trees will become sparse, small, and unhealthy looking, and then suddenly all the trees are gone as you continue to go up. And the same thing happens as you're driving north as well. Of course, the tree line in the northern hemisphere, this would be in Canada somewhere, not within the US. But you can hit tree lines if you're driving around in the Rocky Mountains and you're going up in elevation. So when we're thinking about ecosystems, we want to divide the things that are affecting the organisms into abiotic and biotic factors. So biotic factors are things that are alive or dead organisms, and decaying plant matter and decaying animal matter. Those would all be biotic factors, things that organic molecules that came from a living thing at some point. Those would be biotic factors. Abiotic factors are all the other things. So the amount of sunlight, the amount of precipitation, what kind of soil nutrients are present in a particular area. Those would be the abiotic factors, because the prefix a just means not. So abiotic just means not biotic. So let's talk a little bit about climate change. So we used to call it global warming 30 years ago, and that made people upset. So it got changed to climate change, hoping that people wouldn't get upset, and it didn't work. So it's global warming. There's no other kind of climate change that's happening right now. But it's really a series of questions. Climate change isn't just a single question. Scientists who study the climate of the Earth agree that the reason for climate change is human activity, burning of fossil fuels mostly, also deforestation. So let's go into the details of that a little bit. So the issue of whether climate change is occurring, we can really break it down into a bunch of little questions. So let's just briefly look at the evidence for these. So the first question is the Earth currently warming, and how do we know that? And is this warming abnormal? One of the arguments has been, well, the Earth is always warming and cooling, and the current warming is just part of the normal up and down. So can we say anything about that, about whether this warming is normal or abnormal? What affects global temperature? So what gases in the atmosphere do we know increase or decrease the warming effect of the sun on the atmosphere? And another question is, are humans causing it? Because this is yet another argument, is that, well, maybe global warming is occurring, but humans aren't causing it. How could anything puny humans do affect global climate? That seems very dramatic. So how can we tell that humans are causing it? And the last question is a more subjective one. Is warming going to be bad? There are actually people who argue that warming is going to be a good thing because we'll be able to plant crops in all of those areas that now are too cold to support crops. So that's another question too. So these are really all separate questions that have their own evidence. So let's go through them briefly. So how do we know the Earth is currently warming? Well, we've been directly measuring the temperature of all over the world since the late 1800s. The British Navy played a big part in that. They were very big on routine, keeping very good records. They had ships all over the world, and they took the temperature every day and measured the temperature of the water every day, and we still have all those records. So if you look at this graph here, it only goes back to 1880. And it has data from 4 different sources, 2 within the United States. And they pretty much agree on the average global temperature here. And you can see there's not a big swing here. So this is, 1 degree up is here, and we don't even have 1 degree down. But you can see that they all pretty much agree that, yep, we're in a warming trend right now. But that only goes back, if we've only had the ability to measure temperature directly for 150 years, how do we know this isn't just a little blip? Well, we can estimate temperatures going back much further using ice cores. So we can't go back in time and measure temperature, and nobody was measuring temperature 10,000 years ago. But we have ice from Antarctica and from Greenland that's been piling up winter after winter snowfall for tens of thousands of years. In fact, about 800,000 years without melting. And what happens is when that snow compresses into ice because of the weight of all the other snow on top of it, it traps little bubbles of the atmosphere from the year the snow fell. And we can extract those little bubbles of atmosphere and measure the gases in there. So that we can't measure its temperature directly, but we also know that the isotopes of oxygen that are present are going to vary with the temperature. So that we can measure the isotopes that are present, and then give an estimate of the temperature. So if we look at since the end of the last ice age, which ended between 10 and 12,000 years ago, the last ice age ended. And between 10 and 12,000 years ago, there were humans living pretty much everywhere humans live today. There were humans living in North and South America. There were humans in Australia. There were humans in Europe and Asia, and humans in Africa. Well, we originated. We've been in Africa the longest. But between 10 and 12,000 years ago, that's when the ice age was ending. And so the blue line here is the best estimate of what the global temperature was compared to now, based on those ice cores. And the lighter blue around it, that's the error bars. So their best guess is plus or minus here. So the real line is somewhere inside of this hazy blue area. But we can clearly see that at the end of the last ice age, the temperature went up, and then it started to go down, 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 and it was trending down all the way until about 100 years ago. And when this was first discovered in the 1970s, this ice core data first became available in the 1970s, there was a lot of talk about whether we were heading into another ice age. I remember very well, National Geographic TV shows and news people talking about, oh my gosh, look at it's clearly a downward trend. We're heading into another ice age. But then suddenly it's gone way up. And this is actually from a few years ago, so it's probably even higher than this now. So clearly the most recent increase is not part of a trend here, and this appears to be abnormal. So the gases that we're concerned about, our atmosphere, because of certain gases in it, has what's called a greenhouse effect, and we want some greenhouse effect. So if you don't know what a greenhouse is, a greenhouse has a glass roof usually and sides so that sunlight comes in but the heat stays in. So even in a very cold area, if you have a greenhouse, you can grow plants in there even in the winter. That's where they get this name from, greenhouse effect. So we have gases in our atmosphere that do the same thing. Sunlight, which is energy, comes in, but all the heat doesn't leave. Some of the sunlight reflects back out into outer space. Some of the heat radiates back out into outer space, but not all of it. And the four gases that are most responsible for the greenhouse effect are water vapor, which we can't really do a lot about. Water vapor traps a lot of heat in the atmosphere. Carbon dioxide, this is the one that we're most concerned about with burning of fossil fuels. Methane, which is a product of many processes. I'm going to mention that methane is actually a more powerful greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide, but it's also less stable. And it tends to break down and disappear from the atmosphere, actually turns into carbon dioxide. So although it's worse for global warming, it doesn't last as long in the atmosphere because it tends to oxidize. And nitrous oxide. And all of these are, well, let's forget water vapor. These three are produced by natural processes. Volcanic activity produces carbon dioxide, biological activity produces nitrous oxide and methane, especially bacteria that are decomposing things. So these are produced by natural processes. So the question then is, if these are all present in the atmosphere naturally, how do we know humans are doing it? Okay, so here's more data from the Antarctic ice bubble. So let's look at this. There's actually three graphs here on top of each other in different colors. So the blue graph is temperature. And this graph is actually flipped from that other one. So the present day is over here on the left, and older samples are over here on the right. So we go this way in terms of time. So you can see these are the ice ages. So when the temperature was low, that's an ice age. When the temperature was high, that's an interglacial. And so this only goes back about 500,000 years, although we have samples that go back 800,000 years. They're just not shown on this graph. And you can see the temperature's been going up and down, and we're currently obviously in an interglacial. And also, methane has gone up and down exactly along with those temperatures, as we would expect. If it's a greenhouse gas, when the atmosphere is warmer, we would expect to find more methane. And here in this top graph, the red, this is CO2. And we see the same thing. When we're in an interglacial and the temperature is warm, we have higher levels of CO2. So those things tend to vary together. And we do know that CO2 and methane both help keep heat in the atmosphere. You'll notice oxygen wasn't on that list. Oxygen is not a greenhouse gas. It doesn't do the same thing. Neither does ozone, which is a form of oxygen. Though ozone and oxygen don't have anything whatsoever to do with global warming or the greenhouse effect. So here's another graph kind of showing the same thing. This one is flipped again, so the present day is over here on the right. And this is just showing a more detail of carbon dioxide concentration. So we've been directly measuring carbon dioxide in the atmosphere since the 1950s, and we can measure carbon dioxide in the atmosphere directly in those trapped gas bubbles. Going back 800,000 years, we can directly measure the amount of CO2 that was in the atmosphere. And here we see again, now there's a line that's red and blue, that's the temperature, and then the green line is the CO2. And now this isn't an estimate. The green line is direct measurements from the trapped gas bubbles in these ice cores from Greenland and Antarctica. And you can see again that CO2 and global temperature seem to vary right together. And now we see this green line going way up here. That's the current CO2 level. And it's actually higher than this. It's over 400 parts per million now, because this graph is a few years old. Last year, well, I shouldn't say last year now, in 2019, for the first time, atmospheric CO2 went over 400 parts per million. So that's very high, and the temperature, that's why people are so alarmed about the temperature, because as you see here, the CO2 and global temperature vary in lockstep. Is the temperature going to shoot way up if multiple degrees above its current average, which would be a dramatic change in our climate? Now, we're nowhere near the highest CO2 that there's ever been. During the age of the dinosaurs, CO2 levels were higher, and it was much hotter. During the age of the dinosaurs and even into the current era, after the extinction of the dinosaurs up until about 50 million years ago, the Earth was much hotter than today. CO2 levels were higher than they are today. And in fact, during that time, there was no permanent ice at the North or the South Pole. There are fossil forests on Antarctica that date to that time, and also fossil oil and coal deposits in Antarctica that date from that time. So the Earth has been much hotter than it is today. So we are nowhere near any kind of a hottest we've ever been. We may end up being the hottest since humans have been, though, which may not be so good for us. So how do we know that humans had anything to do with this? Okay, so based on direct measurements and these ice cores, we can measure the amount of carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide in the atmosphere going back 800,000 years. So here we have carbon dioxide suddenly around 1800 starts to shoot way up. The same with methane and nitrous oxide. Woo, way up. What could account for that? What possibly could have happened starting around 1800 that could lead to the massive increase in these components of our atmosphere? Well, that's when we started burning fossil fuels in large amounts. The Industrial Revolution started in the mid-1700s, and by 1900, we were burning enormous amount of fossil fuels. So what's a fossil fuel? Fossil fuels include coal and oil and natural gas. You probably know. They're called fossil fuels because they are actually ancient plants that have been buried in the earth for millions of years, and they didn't fully decompose. They just got compressed, and so the carbon is unoxidized. And so carbon from the atmosphere, as we'll find out when we get to our plants unit, plants take CO2 from the atmosphere and convert it into larger organic molecules. They fix that carbon. They sequester it. Well, fossil fuels are sequestered carbon from millions of years ago. And we have been steadily putting this fossilized carbon back into the atmosphere for 200 years. And we have massively increased the amount of CO2. And nitrous oxide is also produced by burning fossil fuels. And methane, although it's not produced by burning fossil fuels, we have been releasing it from underground during the same process. So when we remove crude oil from wells, a lot of natural gas escapes into the atmosphere during that process. And it used to be considered a useless waste product and was deliberately vented into the atmosphere. Now they try to burn it as it leaves. So they burn it from methane to carbon dioxide, which is, you might see these, oil wells that have this flame coming out of the top. That's them burning the venting methane, and that's actually a good thing. We don't want all that methane going directly into the atmosphere because it is 25 times as powerful at maintaining heat in the atmosphere as CO2, and it's less stable. So burn it to CO2 is actually better than dumping the methane directly into the atmosphere. Deforestation, which we've been doing on a large scale for hundreds of years, started around the same time. Of course, we've been practicing deforestation for tens of thousands of years on a smaller scale, but the amount of deforestation massively started increasing during the Industrial Revolution. And deforestation increases the amount of CO2 in two ways. One way is that just chopping down the trees and allowing them to decay or burning them puts CO2 directly into the atmosphere. The other reason is because a forest absorbs a lot of CO2 with photosynthesis. If you take that forest and turn it into a banana plantation or a wheat farm, that is going to pull less CO2 out of the atmosphere than the forest did. So it's two ways deforestation increases CO2. Another piece of this puzzle is that we actually had a decrease in CO2 that occurred between 1350 and 1850. The amount of CO2 in the atmosphere decreased, and it triggered a global cooling that's called the Little Ice Age. The Little Ice Age is thought to be due to two things. The first thing that people linked it to was the Black Plague, or the Black Death, that killed 50 to 60% of the European and Asian populations. And this was all the way from England, all the way to Japan, and all the way to southern India. That's the areas that were affected by the Black Death. Started in 1350, raged across the continent multiple times, killing 50 to 60% of the population more than once. And then eventually kind of petered out by around 1850. So the total population of Europe and Asia declined during this time. Now, at the same time, colonization of North and South America was occurring, and there was a decline as well in the population of the indigenous peoples who were living in the Americas before Europeans showed up. We know less about that decline and exactly how much of a decline there was, although there are many scholars and scientists today who say that that probably was a factor in the Little Ice Age as well. So that's another piece. So when we have less people, the Earth cooled. So here's another little graph of that Little Ice Age. There was also a warming before that. There was a warming period that was probably caused by the increase in human population and just increase in cooking fires and increase in agriculture and clearing of forests for agriculture. But then the amount of people declined and things cooled for a short amount of time. The last question, the subjective one, is global warming bad? This is one we also, because it's a subjective question, we need to break it down and be really specific. So we want to ask instead, what is the estimation of how many species are going to go extinct? Which environments are going to be most affected? How much is the sea level going to rise, and how is that going to affect coastal ecosystems? So instead of just saying, using a subjective word like bad, we want to be really specific about what we're wanting to know. Because some people do argue that there will be some positives. For example, further north, you will be able to grow crops that previously would not grow there because it was too cold. Okay, so in the next video, we'll talk about the different biomes on Earth and the different types of climates and how those are affected by rainfall and their distance from the equator.